Okay. So I'll welcome you on behalf of the Denominational Affairs Committee. Among the members that will be presenting today are myself, Keith Wilkinson, who's chair of the committee, Lynn Armstrong, and Leslie Kemp. We'll go through the 4 resolutions that will be voted on at the May CUC annual general meeting. So we're hoping it will be interesting to you, or at least clear, and that you'll want to either be a delegate or find out more about being a delegate. And it's likely that once again, we'll have a group here at UCV, and whether or not you're a delegate, if you're curious about what happens at our national level, you could join probably Keith and me and some others here and eat Timbits and drink coffee together while we watch it on Zoom. So we'll start. There's 4 resolutions. The first one that we're going to start with is Keith has gone through with a fine-tooth comb our CUC's bylaws and the proposed changes. And Christian will show slides that go along with Keith's presentation. Over to you, Keith.
Thank you. There's a rule within the bylaws of the CUC that substantive resolutions need to be presented to congregations in advance with an opportunity for feedback. So that's what this is. And they have put forward 4 substantive resolutions, the ones that you see there, to amend the bylaws, to approve goals and strategic objectives for the year ahead, which I think is a very potentially powerful one. It is a way for the congregation, the member congregations, to know what the CUC is planning to do, and then it has an opportunity there to hold them accountable for doing that. And I think they've been doing a pretty good job. That kind of provision was only implemented maybe a decade ago, to have this mandatory review of substantive motions. Approving a budget is expected. I can speak a little bit to that later, but it's not my intention to. The budget is always a difficult thing and comes in some detail and hadn't been released at the time we pulled this together. So the one and then the one that is most substantive is the repudiation of the Doctrine of Discovery that Leslie Kemp will be discussing. So if we can go to the next slide, Christian. And then, yeah, okay. So we're looking at, let me just change my view here. The resolution to amend the bylaws actually, as it notes here, has 47 amendments in the resolution. They're mostly small, technical, what they describe as routine amendments, and bringing the documentation in line with, especially with the need to run electronic meetings. So I think we can, I've looked through these. I don't see anything that's alarming about these proposals. We may find that there's something strange about the electronic meeting provisions that doesn't quite work, but no reason to assume that. The more interesting one is the matter of a treasurer needing to be appointed. Like UCV, it's sometimes hard to find a treasurer who has the time and the skills to do the work. And so the board wants the opportunity to appoint a treasurer if necessary, and if necessary, to pay the treasurer. So this is all detailed in this 55-page document that was sent out. I'm not sure what mechanism it was sent out, but if you want one, get in touch with any member of the committee and we can get that to you if you can't find it. I wanted to point to the one minor amendment on bylaw 5.2 about the expectation of the board to try to reach consensus. The matter of how the CUC makes its decisions has been under discussion for a long time. If you go to the CUC website, you will hunt around a little bit and you can find all of the resolutions that have been forwarded to the general meetings from, I think it's 1963 onwards. And they're kind of interesting to look at because there's a lot of whereases and so on, but the details are there. And there's been a lot of attention to many of the issues that are before us now too. So let's look at the next slide. So this is the one that is typical of these minor changes. This is about the matter of consensus. They've changed the language on the left-hand side that's highlighted to the language on the inside, in the middle. and you can see the words that are changed. So that this decisions replaces questions. The matter, you know, I think I've got that right, do I? Which is the amendment? Yeah. Agree. Yeah. So there's that kind of revision. And as I said, there's about 47 of these throughout the 50-page document. Next slide. So this is a new provision, and as you can see, it says in the event that a treasurer is not elected in accordance with that section of the bylaws, the board may appoint a person or persons, I presume that might mean a company, other than a trustee to assume the responsibilities of treasurer. And they can set the terms on that. We have had a very capable treasurer, I think, over the past number of years, a member with accounting background from Regina. And I don't know if that person's, I guess that person is moving on. And the 614 does provide for the provision for that treasurer to be paid. So there will be a motion at the general meeting in May to approve all of these 47 amendments, including these two that I've mentioned. So I think we can move on. I'll take questions at the end, I presume. We can go on to this one for someone else to address. Back to you, I think, Mary. Oh, budget. Okay. I guess not. You want me to speak to the budget?
I'm wondering if there's a question related to the bylaws before we go on. I thought not. Good job, Keith.
Scintillating. It's scintillating. Can I comment on the budget, or are you going to comment on that, Mary?
I think Kirsten's going to talk about the budget.
Okay.
That's what I've got on the agenda.
Thank you.
And I'll just say a couple of words about the budget. My name is Kirsten Moore, and I'm here today in my capacity as the CUC board secretary and the representative for one of the two representatives for BC, British Columbia. We had many deliberations about the budget, including an extra special meeting in addition to our regular meetings this year, which is why it's delayed coming out. Right now, the treasurer and Vita, being the executive director, are working on the what they call the budget narrative, basically explaining the budget. So a preliminary budget. So we'll be bringing forward the budget for 2023 and a preliminary budget for 2024, since our AGM is in May, but the fiscal year is the calendar year. And so last year, a budget was approved for 2023, a preliminary budget with a deficit of about 56,000. And it was part of what went into that budget is an expectation that the market would be similar to what it has been. Whereas last year, our investments had a much deeper dip than the general. I think there was a drop of about 6, I don't know if it's percents or points overall, generally. And for our holdings, it was 14, a drop of 14. And that would mean that we should take, so there's a whole bunch of investments, and I can get into that. If anybody's interested, I'm happy to talk to you to the level that I understand. But there are a number of different funds, and one of them is very strictly protected as far as its legacy kind of endowment fund. And then there's another general fund that is investments, but that we are free to draw down as we see fit. And generally seeing fit is trying not to cut into the principal. And so those are some considerations to make. But because of that drop in the market last year, and we haven't seen what it's going to do yet this year, it quite affects the budget. So the budget that will be coming out is proposing that we hold steady with the amount that we are withdrawing from the general fund, as it is meant to be there for support in times of need. And we do not want to fire anybody. We do not want to cut staff. So that is kind of the big thing with the budget going on there. There's a desire to keep doing the work that we are doing, and our staff is actually stretched fairly thin with what we're able to do. We would prefer to be able to add to our staff, either hours or a couple other people. So we're aiming at a holding steady year this year. So that's it. And then when it comes out, I'm happy to answer more questions about it. Thank you.
Christian, are there other people online or just Keith? Okay, could you show them for us? They're on the screen. Okay, great. They're not on our screen here, the monitor. I see. Okay. Okay. I'm not using a lot of slides for this section. I'm going to talk a bit about the goals and priorities, such strategic priorities of CUC. And I've gone through, and I might call on Kirsten if there's questions here. The so for some time, maybe 10 years or more, the CUC has presented goals and strategic priorities to the AGM. Wasn't happening when I was CUC Executive Director, but I'm all in favor of it. Lots of transparency here. So I've gone through comparing the proposed goals with last year's and just noted some differences, and there might be some comments from Kirsten about that. So the first goal, which is the bigger picture, and then the strategic priorities narrow it down, to strengthen and nurture community resilience so our congregations, let's get my screen working here, our congregations and Unitarian Universalist communities are connected to each other and thrive spiritually, theologically, organizationally, economically, and socially in a diverse, multi-generational context. And that's the same as 2022, I think. And then the second goal of 4 is to enhance community resilience through exploration, education, and sharing of diverse and inclusive spiritual and organizational practices, including those from our own faith tradition. So that's a slight change from enhanced religious exploration and spiritual growth grounded in the vision, principles, sources, and aspirations of the CUC. So what I noticed here was it seemed that highlighting community resilience rather than the specifics of religious education and spiritual growth, and broadening, so to speak, the sources. That last year, the listing were all things directly related to CUC, the vision, the principles, etc. And this year it says resources from various sources, including those from our faith tradition. So I'm guessing that might be about affirming the kind of work that the decision-making group is doing at looking at sociocracy and convergent facilitation, etc. So making it clear that we're looking outside our own movement for good resources that other nonprofits and organizations are using. Okay, I see Kirsten nodding, so that's a good guess, Mary. The third is the same as last year. It's to advance socially responsible actions to live out our vision of interdependence, love, and justice to bring benefit to Canadian and global communities. And that one remains the same. The fourth one is a bit different. This year, the wording is to strengthen collaborative and interdependent UU networks of congregations and communities. Last year, it specified strengthen local, regional, national, and global networks of collaborative and interdependent UU congregations and communities. So a little bit of a switching around to putting collaborative and interdependent first of all, and using the more generic phrase networks of congregations and communities rather than identifying local, regional, national, and global. And I'm guessing that might be again to make it more organic, that we're talking about UU networks of communities rather than specifically local, regional, national, which to me read as various organizations like the BC region, the CUC, et cetera, et cetera. And Karen, could you bring Kirsten the mic?
And we've also noticed more growing networks of young adults and youth and people that aren't necessarily directly connected to a congregation. So we were stressing that locally.
All right, great, thank you. So the strategic priorities for 2023. Just following on the budget, I mean, when an organization or individual sets strategic priorities, of course, there's some connection with the budget and what the budget allows. In my opinion, strategic priorities aren't always just linked to budget. It has to do with a lot of the volunteer work that people offer and other kinds of initiatives that can happen. But obviously there's a connection there in terms of what can be done. So there's two main sections this year. The first one is to strengthen the national fabric of our Unitarian Universalist congregations and communities by nurturing and enhancing innovation and sustainability. Strengthening ministry and shared ministry. I'm guessing that means professional ministry. And as we use the word ministry in many different ways. Developing, curating, and focusing on Canadian resources to advance religious exploration, spiritual growth, and congregational resilience in a multi-generational context, and ensuring the CUC and its member congregations and communities are well positioned to welcome and embrace those who seek Unitarian Universalism. So that's virtually word for word from last year. And the second part, B, is live into the eighth principle of individual and communal action that accountably dismantles racism and systemic barriers to full inclusion in ourselves and our institutions. So that's just a quote of the eighth principle. And it looks to me like a lot of the subsets under that are similar to initiatives that were named last year, but I'm assuming that this means that those have progressed. And so there's slightly different verbs that are involved. And then the other thing that was a bit different is that these are all subsets under the eighth principle rather than separate categories. Yeah. So the first one is truth, healing, and reconciliation. And Leslie will talk about some of that because she's been part of that initiative directly. And B is enacting environmental justice through respectful stewardship practices. And C, identifying systemic barriers to full inclusion and acting on dismantling these. So that's directly related to the words in the eighth principle. And then D is refugee support. And I wanted to comment and commend our congregation and the CUC. When I became CUC executive director in July of 2000, the first official document I signed was the refugee sponsorship agreement holder for the CUC. And it was pretty scary, I've got to tell you, because in there it says that, you know, a congregation, that under the CUC, a congregation could get a kind of a streamlined process for sponsoring refugees. And so the CUC, as in me and the board and everybody else, were responsible if somehow the people who had signed the piece of paper couldn't come through. So until I met the people in Ottawa and Vancouver and Halifax who had been doing this kind of work and in conjunction with other organizations, I did feel a little lonely sitting there in the CUC office going, and I would have to take these refugees in if something went awry. So that was a big event that some of the board members have been working on for some time. And so for some years, the CUC has sponsored refugees through that agreement. And then several years ago, partly with the leadership of Huguette, we got our own sponsorship agreement holder. So that has facilitated the huge number of refugees that we've been bringing in and working with other groups. So at this point, our congregation personally, individually, probably doesn't get much in the way of resources from CUC, but it's great that it's there for other congregations that don't have the quantity and the volunteer power to do what we're doing. And that's certainly how we got started. Yeah, so those are them. They're not yet on the website, but we can, I think we can still circulate that. Is that right? Yeah, and we will do so. Are there any questions on those at this point? Yeah, John. Karen will bring the mic to you.
Okay. I'm very new to all of this going on at CUCR, but the last bit, we said there was one, I'm not sure if it's whatever that was about, leading into the 8th principle, and under it there were 4 points.
Yeah.
One of them is environmental activism.
Yes.
And another one is refugees.
Yep.
So do I interpret that as meaning that any environmental work that we undertake has got to be done within the context of racism?
Maybe I can invite Kirsten up to respond to that because I'm not quite sure about.
And same thing with refugees.
Actually, I want to be able to see this. No, it does not have to do with how the work has to be done. It has to do with that broad concept that as we were going forward with our social justice work, we are dismantling barriers. So by bringing refugees in, if we're not, I mean, that it follows from the 8th principle, regardless of how we do it. And environmental justice. I mean, it does say if we're not doing the social justice work without understanding the full range of impact that we have on the communities that we're working with or partnering with. And that's part of what the 8th principle is saying, that we should be mindful of how we conduct our partnerships. And so it's looking at that, it's looking at it through that lens. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does, but I'm not satisfied. I'm suspicious of this, of this, not particularly in Canada, but especially in the US, as we all know, this high priority being given to anti-racism work, and everything else is kind of second seat kind of thing. And I'd hate to see the environmental or the refugee work somehow not being acceptable if it's not dealing with racism and other oppressions along the way. I don't disagree that we need to pay attention to all those things, but it's what are we leading with rather than what are we following with.
Mm-hmm. I know there has been intention within the CUC level to partner with Indigenous organizations, for example, on environmental work. And with the refugees, I mean, on one sense, the refugee program, it goes hand in hand with anti-racism, as we were helping people from all over the world be able to come to Canada. It's not that we have to shout anti-racism while we're bringing in refugees, but that there is that sense of partnership rather than saviorness, for example.
That's good.
Yeah.
And this is the point where I should mention that each congregations are invited to give feedback to the CUC on all 4 of these resolutions. And so the Denominational Affairs Committee will meet and find ways to receive feedback from the congregation and do our best to compile that and send it out to the congregation saying what we've submitted. So haven't decided all of those methods. We will be organizing a potluck lunch on March the 3rd for anybody that's interested in considering being a delegate. But I'm thinking that we might also do some kind of a survey feedback form or something and to make it wider. Okay, so I think that's me. Moving on to Leslie, yes?
Yeah, I'd like to see screens maybe. Is it okay if I talk in here? Okay, I can't really do it until I see the screen. Okay. I prepared all these slides. I need to speak to. So I'll just start by saying I'm Leslie Kemp, and I'm wearing the hat right now on the Denominational Affairs Committee. And I've also there's a group here at UCV that's been part of repudiating the Doctrine of Discovery. And there was one detailed forum that a number of people put together. I attended that had excellent information. But okay, so next slide. So I'm going to just start by reading the resolution of the proposed resolution. The Canadian Unitarian Council and its member congregations formally repudiate the Doctrine of Discovery. 2, the decision be communicated to the Canadian Ministers of Crown, Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs and Indigenous Services Canada, the Catholic Church in Canada, Indigenous organizations, and others as necessary. And the third one is an action group be set up immediately to implement this repudiation. So that's the proposed resolution. Now, there's a lot of background information that the CUC shared, some of which I believe they did get from the website that Yvonne Marcus put together here at UCV. We were actually approached to see if we would be willing to co-sponsor this resolution. But after some discussion, we'd been trying to reach the CUC for a few months, and they said, oh, we're going to do our own resolution. And we'd gone past the date where we could bring it to this congregation. So we didn't have the authority here to say, yes, we'll co-sponsor the resolution. So next slide, please. So you may be wondering what the Doctrine of Discovery is, and I'll just do a brief summary of that for those who weren't at the forum, and quoting our own Bruce McIver, who's both a lawyer and historian and partner at First Peoples Law, says the Doctrine of Discovery is a legal principle that European countries extinguished Indigenous sovereignty and acquired the underlying title to Indigenous people's land through, quote, discovering them. And there is just a few more details I want to say about that. One is there in the 15th century, okay, thank you, there are these racist papal bulls, as they're called, that divided up uncivilized Indigenous lands between European powers. And these applied to several different countries, but in the US, there were Supreme Court decisions in the 1820s and 1830s called the Marshall decisions that enforced these as legal principles. And in Canada, it made its way into Canadian law through the St. Catherine's Milling decision. Now, this information is on our website, and you may have to search for it under Doctrine of Discovery, but you'll find a lot of resources and information. And this doctrine has been repudiated around the world. And try again. So the Supreme Court has grounded its interpretation of Section 35 of the Constitution on this dubious and racist legal principle, that these principles that underlay the doctrine of discovery. And so you may hear assertion of crown sovereignty. So it's, you know, considered a euphemism, a Canadian euphemism for the doctrine of discovery. And so it's really important that this doctrine be repudiated, because it's central to Canadian Aboriginal law, and it's also reason why many Indigenous people reject the Canadian legal system and government policies on reconciliation. So I do urge you to read more about it. The next slide, please. So I just want to give a bit of background on CUC's work. And they CUC did respond to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission back in 2006. Now I'm remembering the dates, but we call upon all religious. Okay, this is in response to this. The Truth and Reconciliation had a number of calls of action. So number 49 is we call upon all religious denominations and faith groups who have not already done so to repudiate concepts used to justify European sovereignty over Indigenous lands and people, such as the Doctrine of Discovery and terra nullius. And Yvonne, I just want to point out that there was an act of Parliament you may be aware of, an act respecting the Indigenous, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And in the preamble and in the actual act, it does have language that suggests that the government is going to repudiate the doctrine of discovery. Now, I don't know enough about it to comment kind of further, but I'm just quoting for one sectional. Whereas all doctrines, policies, and practices based on or advocating the superiority of peoples or individuals on the basis of national origin or racial, religious, ethnic, or cultural differences, including the doctrines of discovery and terra nullius, are racist, scientifically false, legally invalid, morally condemnable, and socially unjust. And further goes on to say the government of Canada rejects all forms of colonialism and is committed to advancing relations with Indigenous peoples that are based on good faith and principles of justice, democracy, equality, non-discrimination, good governance, and respect for human rights. Now, the action plan, they have 2 years. So by June, supposedly they've implemented everything. I guess we'll see what actually happens on the ground. It's not always what's in law that matters. It's what happens on the ground, as we all know. But if we can go to the next slide, please. Just to who has repudiated, and there's a list including, several churches in Canada, United Church, Presbyterians, the Quakers, and also the UUA repudiated it. I think it was in 2012, if I remember correctly, and World Council of Churches. Next slide, please. CUC does have some history of engagement on the whole topic of reconciliation. And as Mary mentioned earlier, there was, they committed to, not this point, but the next point, committed to adopting, okay, actually just go back, sorry, the UN declaration that I just quoted from. And that the CUC and UMOC, the Unitarian Universalist Ministers of Canada, delivered a joint statement to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 2014. Next slide. And then out of that, there came to be a task force. I was one member of that put together a whole series of reflection guides intended to both educate and engage congregations in these, concepts of reconciliation from a Unitarian point of view. And there were children's guides, youth guides. I was involved in the adult guide we piloted here, and there was congregational training offered. And we were actually going to do the full rollout of the adult guide in 2020, and the pandemic hit. And I'm not really up to date. I'm trying to find out, where that's at, if congregations are still engaging in some of this. Obviously, any curriculum that one develops does need to be updated, but I think it's still really worth having those kind of sessions. And we prepared a booklet that was presented at the Parliament of World Religions in 2018 based on that work. So then I think there's one final slide I have. Yes, the action plan. So the resolution process for CUC always, it's supposed to come with an action plan. So if anybody proposes a resolution, you're also supposed to come up with an action plan. I was part of a task force a few years ago that looked at how we even do the CUC resolution process. And what was happening is a lot of groups, congregations, et cetera, were coming forward with very lofty resolutions. And then once the resolution was passed, everyone said, oh, we've done it. But actually the work of the resolution still had to be done. So we came up with this process. And so this proposes that, as I read the resolution anyway, that the CUC is saying we'll repudiate the concept right away, but we still need a 2-year process, both to actually carry out this work and to engage congregations in the work. So they break it down into 2 categories. One is the CUC and CUC staff and board, what they need to do and who they need to consult with, this summary, and collaborate with others, including trying to get the Pope to repudiate the concept. So that should be interesting. And, sharing resources. And again, a lot of the resources that they have cited, we have on our website here at UCV. And then member congregations. And I think this is important if we repudiate the concept, and that when I say we, I'm meaning the CUC, all of us. I think it's important to understand what this concept is all about, and to we've had a detailed forum here, but not everybody was, at that forum, and other congregations may not have done that work. So it's we need to learn more about this, what the impact has been and the ongoing impacts of the concept, and how we can continue to advocate for the repudiation of this concept by the Pope. I don't know if that's realistic or not, quite honestly, But that's kind of where it's at. So I would really invite questions and comments.
Mentioning about different groups you'll be contacting, mentioned the Catholic Church. My recollection was, at least with the residential schools, that wasn't just Catholic churches, but also I think Anglican. I'm not sure to what extent the Anglican Church was involved in the Doctrine of Discovery and Terra Nullius, but is there maybe appropriate, and other groups as need be, but is the Anglican Church maybe one group that you should definitely contact as well?
In fact, they produced some excellent materials on that. And there's some videos that were from the Anglican Church, I believe, that are on our website. I know I was surprised that CUC didn't mention the Anglican Church. But Yvonne, I don't know if you have anything further to say on that.
Well, I've just saying, I know that the Anglican Church has repudiated it.
But in terms of contacting with, the congregant groups, I thought maybe it'd be nice. I meant, all suggestions, adding the group in that number 2 item. Just mentioning after Catholic Church, mention also Anglican Church specifically. That's all I'm suggesting.
Okay, yes. And so I think this is where we need to come in to give very specific feedback. And I believe the date is March 21st. And so there is a group, I'm hoping we can, I sent out a doodle poll for a number of dates. So the group that's part of, and several people are here that have been part of that. I don't know what we call it, a team or working group or whatever here at UCV. And I think we should look closer at this and receive input from other people. And what suggestions might we have? Is the wording of the resolution okay? Do we want to add some things? I don't think the wording of the resolution does name the Catholics just in the wording. So we may want to change some of those things or suggest changes. And I know, Lynn, you said you're at one of a meeting of the action groups, or the CUC held a meeting for congregations. And there was some controversy about the wording of the first resolution because it named CUC and member congregations. So if the wording of that resolution means, can the CUC decide for member congregations? And I think that may be controversial, for example. So do you want to say something about that?
Yeah, I think you're referring to a roundtable. They held a leaders roundtable January 28th for a really early feedback session. And there were quite a few, very good suggestions made at that point, but they won't be releasing a new version until after all the feedback comes in from congregations, March 21st. And we are looking at how can we help this congregation consolidate feedback. And we're already talking about maybe some other Zoom calls, some other ways of connecting.
Yeah, whether we have another, if there's enough interest to have another meeting just to invite contributions from here at UCV, that might be an option. And have the group that's most closely involved with that look at it, really carefully. Hands.
I think that the repudiation of this document or declaration of discovery is an obvious no-brainer, but I'd like to point out something else about it that many people may never have thought about it. And that is the very fact that the people in bodies that issued those declarations and documents felt it necessary to do that indicates that they knew at the time they were doing something wrong. Because they could never have felt the need to issue such a document if it was obvious to everyone that they had discovered this place. They had to actually issue a document stating that this evil thing they were doing was actually the law now.
Good point. Okay, if there are no further comments on this, I'll turn it over back to Mary. Thank you.
And the next section is Lynn going over some other initiatives that are coming forward. And Hans, I liked your comment because at General Assembly one year, I went to a Unitarian and history lecture, and the woman was both a Unitarian minister, but a history major. And she commented that part of her research was based on the idea if you find out there were signs saying no spitting, you can guarantee there was spitting going on. Lynn.
Yeah, oh, I know, that's because that's there. Does that work? Is that, that's okay, okay. Yeah, since we're looking at these resolutions this year from the CUC, we just thought it was an opportunity to share a little bit more information about other things that are going on, sponsored by the CUC, that we have involvement in. And that this kind of brings together, it's in the context of the CUC being, you know, a big organization and doing a lot more than just annual meetings and resolutions. And so on the first one, if we get a slide up, I think about inclusive action groups, inclusivity, we've got Tomiko to tell us about them. Thanks.
Well, this idea that I'd be presenting was sort of sprung on me, but we've only had one meeting and there's a series of 3. Excuse me, and it was all supposed to be about learning about inclusivity and culture shift work, whatever that means. And so the idea was that we would break up into groups and you choose which breakout group you want to be in. And then you would talk about actions that you want moving forward. But the one that we did, maybe Hisako also took part in a different group, and Catherine, and maybe you've got a more positive experience than I did. So there were different groups. There was gender, age, class, non-traditional relationships and family, race, colonialism, disability, and engaging men. And UCV was well represented in probably most of those breakout groups. And so we were supposed to meet for 2 hours, and we probably spent more than an hour just getting to know each other. And I was in the race group, and a lot of the IPA were in there too. And I was really quite surprised that a lot of the other congregations are struggling to even get to the point where they can do any kind of action because it's not even recognized as an issue. And so there's a lot of good intentions, but you're dealing with a congregation of different sizes who are oblivious to the concept of colonialism or race or any kind of barrier. And when these small action groups come along and say, well, let's do something about it, then you get resistance. And so in our breakout group, we spent a lot of time just detailing the problems of just getting to the point where we can educate people, and then from there moving forward to doing something. Although I think education is an action in itself. And then the idea is that in the second meeting, we're going to talk about actions that we could do either within our congregation or as a group of the whole across the CUC. And then in the third one, we're going to talk about intersectionality, about how all of these different groups connect. And I think it was under the topic of colonialism. I don't know, Hisako, can you suggest anything else? Do you want to come up?
Yes, I was in the colonialism.
Take your mask off, yeah.
I was in the colonialism group. But, you know, when you think about colonialism, you can't just come up with the actions, right? You need to like reflect on like what we are doing as settlers on this land, and then undo this colonial thinking, and then actions. We need to do whatever actions we do, like we need to do it in relationship with the land and the people of this land and other people. So it was like we couldn't come up with any kind of actions or like go on to that place. So what we did in our group was we had an like an indigenous elder in the group, and she was saying we need to get rid of this colonial thinking. So we introduced each other, we talked about our connection to the land or ancestry, and we started from there. So yeah, if we really want to come up with a decolonizing action, then that process of relationship or connection or all those things need to be like discussed before. So I don't know. I don't know, like I don't really know how to proceed to the next session. Maybe, you know, we need to like talk to the organizers because it didn't work at all in our group.
Yeah.
So,
It's a huge topic, and
yes.
you only have 2 hours, and it's a bit crazy. But on the other hand, you know, it was pretty cool to be able to meet across the country.
Yeah, so it was an action. It was, we are in this action of decolonizing our way of thinking and our way of coming up with this action group. So like it was wonderful. People are happy. We were happy. We did that, but like we weren't really following the formula. So.
Catherine, were you also in a group?
I don't think I'm going to add very much except to realize, as we were gathering, that we're all at such very different levels of understanding of what the issue is, and getting to anything that would be a change would probably be a good thing. And my conclusion was that within the area that I'm interested in the environmental actions, there's an obvious lack of people of other than European background. And so that's the area of my examination, but that can't be everybody's. So it's going to be a lot of individual effort and maybe reporting back on.
Hi, Tamiko, you've listed a bunch of groups, and I didn't catch the last group that you mentioned, or maybe I didn't understand what it meant.
Well, I don't know. It was called Engaging Men. And I think it's in reaction to the extreme lack of men that were signing up. I don't know. Of what?
Has nothing to do with marriage, getting engaged. Sorry, I'm making a joke.
What have we've got you connections. So this is a,
sorry, I'm very
sorry?
slow.
Oh, sorry.
Just quickly, I might be just not out of line, but since Hisako mentioned about action, I got the email from her. I'm a member of the IPA, right? And she gave a link to watch 2 National Film Board movie about the indigenous peoples, ordinary people. And one was the red dress, then the other one is how you here of a highway. Anyway, point is, that's very good. I know all about, but it's very gentle. But you know, that kind of things really like stay with me. So if you have a chance, please watch it. Please send it to all Unitarian Church community members. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Megumi, for mentioning that. Because I've noticed too, Hisako does a lot of posting, you know, on our UCV chat. And really, it's, well, I know. I just want to make a brief comment tagging on to that because you make great recommendations. There's films available. And I just wanted to say personally, you know, I read one of your posts just a few days ago with a really deep, long and thoughtful reflection. So is it okay to go ahead on the next slide? Did you want to say something more about that? Go ahead.
I just wanted to clarify it's a IPA group, like Google group, so it's not UCB chat. Well, I'm not part of the UCB chat.
You know what? That's so interesting because like we've got quite a few different email threads, right?
Yeah.
And when I read that, I thought that was going out to everybody and I think it should. Maybe I need to forward it then to the UCV
Yes,
chat.
please.
Okay. Understood. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so I want to let you know about UU Connections because there is a thing that's called the Pollinator Projects, and it's sponsored by the Canadian Unitarian Council, and this is one of them. And Xenia and Zoe came up with this idea of offering a monthly opportunity for Canadian UUs to connect online. And the next opportunity is actually today at 4 p.m. once a month. And what struck me, so over the years, I've attended many national and regional gatherings that used to be in person and now often, you know, online instead. But my favorite part was always about meeting and getting to know other Unitarians from across the country and comparing notes on how we do things. You know, we do things differently. It's a great cross-pollinization of ideas. And now we don't need to wait until the next national conference or regional workshop. We can get right to the best part, the networking every month. There's breakout rooms of small enough groups to allow for lots of conversation. And I just want to encourage you to give it a try. And the main reason for wanting to promote this is that both Xenia and Zoe have connections here at UCV. We see them here. And Zoe is now working for the South Fraser Unitarian Congregation. So the link on this slide is also in the information that went out in our weekly e-bulletin. It's a hard one to remember. If you try Googling it, make sure not to leave a space between UU and connecting. And on to the next slide. Brief mention of the UUA article discussions, the UUA Article 2 discussions that are unfolding. A few years ago, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association decided to take a completely fresh look at the values that hold them together. And the principles and sources that we're familiar with are embedded in Article 2 of the UUA bylaws. And there's a vote coming up this year at the June annual meeting to replace them with different language and with different presentation. And instead of numbering them in the same way the principles are numbered that we're familiar with, they're looking at shared values being presented as a flower graphic with petals, all relevant. And they include generosity, justice, interdependence, equity, transformation, pluralism, and with love at the center. So UCV is not a member of the UUA. We're a member congregation of the CUC, the Canadian Unitarian Council. But decisions of the UUA clearly affect us. So please save the date, March 19th. We're going to hold a forum here sharing just specifically on this topic. And we'll be sharing lots of resource information and background information in advance because these are very complex issues with many points of view. And that's it. Back to Mary.
Great. So I just have a couple of minutes to make note of some things that might be coming your way. First of all, I'm pleased at the number of people here today. I know that people sometimes hear, the first time I heard CUC many years ago, somebody said to me, "Are you going to the CUC?" And I thought, what does this mean? I mean, the CUC is an office in Toronto. It's and they meant the CUC conference and assumed that since I seem to be getting what one person called aggressively involved, I would know all about it, and I didn't have a clue. So, so I'm interested. I think it's for me connecting is my thing, and so a way to connect with Unitarians across Canada. And especially when there's some informal thing, and there's always some opportunity with informal stuff. Even if you're here on Zoom, you see the gallery. I see people, probably about half the people I've met in person at some point. And you might hear somebody say something. And with the wonders of technology, you just Google that person's name or their congregation, and you can send them a note saying, "Hi, I'm Mary. I'm in Vancouver, and I liked what you said." So the other reason to get involved is our congregation contributes about $30,000 every year to the CUC. So it's important what priorities they set. You know, we're not required to do everything that the CUC does, but we want to make a good investment of our funds and to believe that we're in alignment and can work with other congregations on those initiatives. So I encourage you to find out more about being a CUC delegate. If you're going to Ottawa or want to go to Ottawa, there's a symposium this year based on the 8th principle, but you don't have to go to Ottawa. You can be here, and hopefully we'll provide a bit of networking and, as promised, Timbits for that. And all you do is, if you want to get more details about the CUC delegate process, just go on our website and search CUC delegate, and you'll come up with a post that's very thorough. And the Denominational Affairs Committee will send out an update along with the March monthly email newsletter. And in the meantime, I'll compile that material I presented on strategic priorities and goals and send it out as well, since I didn't have time to put that into a way that would show up on the screen. And I think that's all I've got to say. Yeah. Contact any of us on the Denominational Affairs Committee. We love to talk about the CUC. Okay, thanks for coming. Yeah. But I
Yeah.